We'll start by removing the brush caps. The brushes have to be removed before you go any further. Now, the next step in disassembling the sander is to remove these 4 screws on the side of the handle. You also see that whoever replaced the cord didn't do such a good job of tucking all the wires in nicely. Now, when taking one of these apart, a very useful thing to have is a muffin tin, because what you can do is put whatever hardware in question in its own bin, and later on when you're faced with, 15 or 20 screws that all look more or less alike, but are of varying lengths, you'll have a pretty good chance of getting them back where they actually went. We'll need to remove the screw here that holds the switch to the handle half. You'll need to remove the 2 leads that hold the field to the switch. Now I'm also seeing that this lead here has had a repair to it, probably when the cord was done. It's got electrical tape around it, and for the sake of saving the bulk of the tape and make a nicer job of it, we're going to put shrink tubing on that. You can now remove the screw that holds the ground wire in place. There's a little star washer. Take the 2 screws out on opposite sides of the handle. Now, with a sander that had dust collection, there are 3 screws that hold this back cover on. Now, it's critical to remove this, because if you try and remove the armature without that, you're not going to get very far. Inside this housing, there's a small cast aluminum fan, separate from the armature's actual cooling fan, that runs dust collection. That's why these sanders are such good sanders. It's a very positive system. It works quite well. Just comes up like that. Now you can't necessarily take these off, so what we're going to do is clip these leads, because they don't fit through the holes. They're put on factory after the sander is assembled. And all you have to do is just snip them off, leave as much lead as you can. You have a little extra material to work with. Set this there for reference. What size terminals they were. That screw out of there. Now, this casting here forms part of the dust collection. While we're in here, we're going to clean all this built-up sawdust out. But there's really no need to take in this part other than to give it a good scrubbing. Set that aside. And this is typical of the impacted dust. This sander will pick up about 90% of the dust from being used, but not all of it winds up in the bag, so some of that's going to have to be cleaned up. Next step, we're going to remove the upper casting that the bag actually mounts to. Set that with its screw, which allows you to access the field wires. So now when you pull it through, it's going to be a lot easier. Now we're going to remove the front knob. Get that out of the way. And the front casting. The next step is to clean out the dust in the fan housing, because the screws that hold the field housing in place are actually tucked back in here, and they're only accessible around that fan. Now, a small screwdriver will work, a pick, but what I'm going to do is just break this up. There's not really anything in here you can harm. Just don't slam in your fan, because you don't want to break your blades off. But this is just a lot of work the sander's done. And you need to get past that to go much further with our repair job. Does a great job picking it up. Not so good at putting it in the bag, admittedly, but nobody's perfect. There's one. Here's the other. There are 3 screws on the 503. One at the bottom, 2 at the top. Now I want to remove the 2 screws on the outside of the sander. These hold the wear bar in place, and usually on these sanders, removing this wear bar will make it a little bit easier to get the screw housing off without too much in the way of sweating and cursing. This wear bar here is a quarter cable feature. Even the earliest sanders had a form of it. This is a hardened steel bar, 2 screw holes through it, and what it does is it prevents the sanding belt from cutting into the aluminum housing. This wear bar here has been cut into by the belt due to not having the sander set correctly for the tracking. But what we're going to do, due to the thickness of the material and the fact that quarter cable made the holes equidistant between the top and bottom, so we're going to flip the wear bar over and reuse this side, which gives another 50-60 years out of this wear bar. Now we're going to retract the front roller assembly, because hidden down here in the corner is a screw which pins this front edge of the field housing, which is a trait shared with the A3/504. As an aside, no one really knows why the A3 is not called the 503 and the 503 is the 504. That would make sense to most people, but for whatever reason, it didn't deport a cable, and that's why I keep saying that. I'm not crazy, that's actually true. So we're out of here. Yeah. Now, I'm going to tap on this with a mallet very gently. Now use 2 screwdrivers to gently work the sander away. Now that we've worked that down to that little 90-degree turn there, there's a baffle on the outside of the field too that if you just yank straight out, it'll wind up getting bent, and it's not really doing the wires any favors either. We now have our field housing out of place. Now we're going to disassemble this and clean this out. But from what I can see, the field windings don't look too bad. We're going to test this with a meter before we reassemble it, just to be on the safe side. But the sander, when we tested it, I ran it briefly, not under a load. It sounded pretty good, so we should have a pretty clean bill of health electrically. I'm going to set that piece aside. And that leads us to the armature itself. This armature is, if there is a theory that sander wasn't used much, this is a soldered armature. Each of these commutator bars is soldered to the wire that's connected to, whereas later ones were stamped. Now, we're going to remove the fan at this stage, because now we can grab the armature to keep it from turning. And you need a pretty strong grip to do this. But, nut comes off. It's a standard right-hand nut. There's a washer underneath that. Now the fan can be removed. Now the fan is it's a rather loose press bed. It'll usually come off in your hand. This fan here, all it does is it runs the dust collection. It's not that cooling fan. It's actually balanced from the factory. You can see the drill mark right there. And that's just an indication of the level of quality of these sanders. Underneath the fan, there's a spacer. We don't want to lose that because that prevents the fan from rubbing in this case here. Now at this stage, the armature can be pulled out, again by hand. It usually doesn't take much. And there it is. Now this armature doesn't look too bad. It is also going to be tested and turned. In this instance, even if this armature was damaged, I have 3 or 4 spares of this particular one. So it's not really an issue. Now this is an early armature, which bears with the belief the sander didn't see a whole lot of use. The original ones used what they call turbine fan, as opposed to the axial fans used in the later models.